From Chicago's CAN TV, a look at the week's events is reported in the newspapers, in the blogs and online, and on radio and TV. This is Chicago Newsroom.
Well, hi there, and welcome to Chicago Newsroom here on CAN TV. I'm Ken Davis, and welcome to another program. We have not, for the last couple of weeks, talked about our favorite topic, which is schools financing and schools and education in Chicago. And we're going to rectify that today because I'm really happy to say that Rod Estvan is joining us from Access Living in Chicago. And Rod is one of these people that I've wanted to have on the show for a very long time because there are just some people who just know stuff. They've been around for a while and they just kind of know a lot of the little secrets and intricacies. And I've seen you, Rod, on a number of occasions addressing various people and speaking truth to power. And I thought today might be, especially given the fact that we just had a Board of Ed meeting yesterday that was rather significant, to have you come in and see if you can explain to us what the heck is going on. So will you do that, please?
Sure. Well, first of all, I want to thank you, and it's really a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
What happened yesterday at the board meeting?
The Board of Education met yesterday.
Yeah, the Board of Education met, and it wasn't until after the meeting that many reporters began to find out that a large bond offering that CPS was going to put forward, around $875 million, was not going to be put forward, and it was going to be put on hold because, as the city said, the investors had hesitation and wanted to look further at the issue.
Looks like they really did have hesitation too.
They did.
7.7% or something?
It is, if you think about it, it's really about 6 times what anybody as a normal person would get in a certificate of deposit.
It's incredible. I mean, I saw the quote that this is the largest junk bond rating ever done by a state or local government. I presume that means in the history of the United States. I mean, it's incredible.
There's never been one that has passed in recent history that for a public entity that has this kind of rating. So we're really talking about I don't know if you recall, but Dennis Kucinich was in this situation in Ohio. Mm-hmm. And they were in that level of problem here with CPS. Mm-hmm. And this is an indication that the institutional investors, after Governor Rauner's and the Republicans in the legislature's bill on bankruptcy for Chicago and takeover, are very unnerved about the possibility of losing money.
Now, we'll talk about that in a minute, this whole idea that we should just basically declare bankruptcy and walk away from it. But I mean, I would think that, yes, as it is, because our ratings are so terrible, junk bond and beyond, that if you are a bond buyer or an investor, you're nervous enough as it is, but then to see that at any given moment the governor might just sort of walk in the big boots and just take over, then you're going to lose that money. So it's a real problem.
It's a real problem, and it wouldn't have been as big of a problem before 2008. And 2008 told many people that hold bonds in America that your bond insurance, because every one of these issuances are insured, may not be worth the paper it's written on, because the bond insurance entities could not cover the kind of losses that they experienced. Mm-hmm. So the confidence in the bond insurers is not that high. Mm-hmm. If everybody believed there's no problem, I'll take the risk, I'm insured, I'll get my money, it's these guys that are taking the risk. Mm-hmm. There's not confidence of that in that community anymore after 2008. It's in question.
So you're kind of painting an interesting, this is a little kind of a side note, but you're painting an interesting picture here that it may not be a simple case of these bond guys are just the bad guys. I mean, they are being asked to expose themselves to a huge amount of risk.
Right, for a lot of profit, and I don't know if your audience knows, but if you're a resident in Illinois and you purchase one of these bonds, you pay no taxes at all. They're 100% tax exempt for Illinois residents, both federal and state. So that's normally the interest rate paid on municipal bonds, which is what we call these, is much lower than it is in corporate bonds because of the tax differential. They kind of take it into consideration that you're not going to pay taxes on it, so they get a better deal. Well, in this situation, we're talking very high interest rates and a tax exempt. So it's still very tempting. There still may be investors out there that may bite on this because this is a lot of money. But I think that people are going to have to hear the right things to bite, and it'll be more risky players. Some entities cannot touch these bonds. For instance, there's a number of pension funds that explicitly in their bylaws prohibit them from purchasing anything rated this low. So they can't touch them. So that reduces their market to a specialized group. And even CPS's situation is so difficult that the money that is held for the bonds now is going to a bank in Utah that has a troubled credit history itself.
Oh, wow.
It's one of the only major banks in the United States that failed the last stress test that was issued. Zion's National Bank, which at one point was owned by the Latter-day Saints, has been one of the recipients. So the normal entities that they used in Chicago, Northern Trust and the other big banks, are not involved in holding the money for some of their newer bonds. And I don't know why. There's never been any discussion on it, but I was surprised when I did look at an offering to see it was Zion National out of Utah, Salt Lake.
So just help me understand this a little bit more. We don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but the Board of Education says we need whatever it is, $875 million.
Right.
If we give you 7.5 or 7.7 or whatever it is % return on that, will you come on board with us, basically, right? Will you play with us?
That's right, and they have to get institutional buyers to do this because they're done in big chunks.
Yeah.
You and I just can't go buy, $20 worth of CPS bonds.
That's what I was going to say. So I just can't go out and buy $100
Right.
worth.
I mean, they're done in big chunks through institutional investors, and then it filters out from there. Through other ways. So they have to convince this marketplace that this is a good deal.
And the people who essentially, as far as we understand, told CPS, this isn't going to fly right now, those are the people who are like the deal makers, right?
Yeah,
they're the packagers.
They're the packagers. They're also maybe the raters for institutional investors. They're the bond. I haven't read the bond buyer articles on this yet, but they'll usually quote a few of the key people, and the Tribune quoted a few of the key people that are involved in it. And these are all institutions that Governor Rauner would be familiar with. I mean, to be frank with you, he knows these kind of people.
So, which of course begs the question, can't Governor Rauner just pick up the phone and say, come on, George, do this for me?
You know what, he could play a good guy role in here. I do think that he, for his own credibility, doesn't necessarily want to trash his financial credibility by giving people a bad deal. And in his heart of hearts, he doesn't, I think, believe CPS is survivable. To be honest with you. And that's his honest judgment, like it or not. He's said that now for a while. He said it during the campaign.
Right, which is why he is advancing his own idea, which is, well, you tell me if I'm being fair about this. I've said this, and I know other people have, and I don't really know if I'm being fair when I say this, but isn't this really kind of similar to the way he operated his financial services company? You go into a troubled company, you chop it into little pieces and sell the parts, and basically walk out with whatever you can get.
Some of the companies he bought did go file for bankruptcy. So his vision of the bankruptcy process is different than the average consumer's vision. It's much more a functional idea, that bankruptcy is a tool. You use it when you have to use it. You don't use it unless you have to use it. And he is personally protected because this is a corporation that he had. And so he has like entities that he would buy, and they may not generate an appropriate profit. And I wouldn't say that he necessarily stripped them, but their profit future based on a reasonable analysis of the future was grim. And they would, in some cases, if he couldn't sell them at a loss or whatever, he had been involved in bankruptcies. So, and that's that's not an uncommon practice. If you go over to the federal courts, there's bankruptcy cases daily, all kinds of entities. This is a normal thing. For business.
But you would not find a major United States Board of Education sitting in the pews waiting to be bankrupted.
No, there's only been a couple of municipal bankruptcies in the last 100 years. They're relatively rare. Yeah. And to give credit to somebody who's very pro bankruptcy, Ron Sandek, who is a representative in the House, he did a number of committee meetings on this issue in the House, and I have to give him credit. He gave a balanced presentation, even though he's fully in support of allowing municipal entities to bankrupt themselves. There was testimony to the dangers of bankruptcy, and there was testimony indicating that it could be a new start, but nobody would indicate that new start would be painless.
So, given your history of studying these things, and by the way, I want to say one of the things that you have made an extensive study of is the history of the Schools Finance Authority, which we endured for over 10 years here in Chicago. Given what you know about this, is there any logic at all to the idea of just saying, oh, we give up, let's bankrupt it and start over? Does it make any sense at all?
It makes sense only within the context of having another motive, and that is to get rid of ongoing contracts, in particular the Chicago Teachers Union contract. The normal way that this has been approached for the last 60 years has been restructuring with the oversight. So we had the Big Mac in New York when New York City restructured. We had the Chicago School Finance Authority when CPS was restructured in 1980. And they instituted oversight over the legal entities. And they had certain authorities over that legal entity. So they could say yes, no, over many budget items. They could control the spending. They had auditing power. And in the case of Chicago, there was a long time where Chicago operated on a very marginal budget. The capital infrastructure declined. There were thousands of staff let go, far more than what we're seeing now, into the 1980s. And even the complaints about the pension pickup that we see discussed all the time in the media were actually a result of this process of financial crisis, because there was no money to give teachers raises, so they gave them a theoretical raise through a pension pickup deal.
So, so then you would be sympathetic with those who say, well, this actually is income for us. If we lose that, we're losing what is, for all effects and purposes, income.
Oh yeah, I mean, this will be a real cut to teachers, I mean, if they take it. And it's a decision that I think the members of the CTU have to make on how much this will help them keep their jobs.
Well, not to beat a dead horse here, but the idea of bankrupting something like CPS would have the very efficient effect, as you say, of being able to essentially dissolve any relationship with CTU, but it wouldn't dissolve the other relationships with the banks and the people who own who we owe money to.
And I'm sure, Ken, you're aware of what happened in Detroit. I mean, they went through the bankruptcy process, and the community had to wage a battle to even protect the art collection in the museum in Detroit. I'm not saying the banks wanted blood, but they didn't want to take the haircut that they were going to take. And that's their lawyer's job. Their lawyer's job is to protect their interests and to get as much realizable money out of the assets.
And their lawyers are better than the lawyers who represent, say, some kid living on the West Side.
Oh, of course, of course. Not necessarily better than the lawyers that CPS could put forward in that situation, though. I mean, they have access to pretty good legal counsel. But the outcomes of this are not certain. And I think the way Representative Sandek presented this in his committees was amazingly fair. You had stories where there was lesser impact and more impact. They actually discussed some of the municipal bankruptcies and the things were done and things that judges didn't allow to be done. They were it was very comprehensive. Unfortunately, most of the members of the General Assembly did not attend those committee meetings. Yeah. The number of, I'm a registered lobbyist, so I was there. And there were, initially the first one, everybody was there, was packed. And then the subsequent ones, there were fewer. But he, I think he did a reasonably good job on that.
Is it fair to compare this effort to bring oversight to the Board of Education to what happened in Flint, Michigan, that you bring in an oversight board and the next thing you know, you're poisoning the population?
Well, the proposal in the Republican bills, there's one in the House and the one in the Senate, has no containment of what that entity that would take over CPS would do. And I think it's unconstitutional. And I'll tell you why. This Constitution of Illinois requires our state to support public education. It's in the Constitution. This bill specifically exempted liability from the state of Illinois once a takeover took place. So we have a takeover with no money, with no accountability. So, it's sort of like you're on your own, but we're going to give you guidance, and we're going to put the people in control that are going to give you guidance.
I saw something that you wrote. It was a comment to an article in Substance News, George Schmidt's newspaper, that I thought was so insightful, because it's very easy for those of us who look at this to say, this is a concentrated, organized, and well-planned effort on the part of people with money and influence to destroy the public schools as we know them and turn them over to a bunch of charter operators and private schools and basically get us out of the business of public education.
And I don't agree with that. I think it's...
I was kind of surprised to see that.
I think it's much more chaotic than that. I think that public officials don't have a clear vision on where they're going on all this. Some people would like who knows what percentage of charter schools to be in Chicago. There's certainly a constituency to have middle-class selective schools. There's certainly a constituency that would argue that historic black schools be maintained and keep in existence. There's a whole series of constituencies on where the district's going. And I think one of the things that's telling in this is if, and I haven't seen it yet, if they really have a plan in mind to go to bankruptcy, then they were given a unique opportunity by Governor Rauner to actualize it. They could have made statements that said, it's an interesting concept, but we don't agree with the way your bill's formulated, but we can talk about this. There was no discussion like that. From Speaker Madigan, President Cullerton, Rahm Emanuel, every publicly elected Democratic official that represents the people of Chicago opposed this. They didn't open up their hands to say, let's make a deal, because that isn't what this was all about. There was no clear vision, and it's very chaotic. I mean, if you look at the end of the control of the Chicago School Finance Authority, it really ends at the point that Mayor Daley, the younger Mayor Daley, takes control under the 1995 legislation. And then when he gets control, he brings in Paul Vallis and Gary Chico, both very bright men. And the assumptions that they had coming into this district were not correct. They assumed that they could operate and do all kinds of programs and stuff, and it could be a win-win for the city and for the mayor. And they became to realize that the infrastructure of the school system, because of the years of cost containment from the School Finance Authority, was in collapse. And they went on one of the biggest building campaigns that this city has seen since probably the FDR work. We have Walter Payton. We have numerous schools that were built. We have the roof on Carl Schurz High School.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's a multi-million-dollar
Right.
roof.
Just that one roof
Just the
alone.
one roof
It's a
alone.
big roof.
It's a big roof, and redoing of the library, which is a fantastic testament to the original architectural design and integrity of the building. But they came in and they had to borrow money. And their vision wasn't, at that time, to like charter off all these schools or bankrupt the district. Their vision was different. And then they began, there is a strong argument for having economic factors of in the educational marketplace for other kinds of players, charter schools. And they're very open to that because it makes a lot of sense to them. You know, it's like how they operate in the economy. You offer competition, you offer choices, and then we seek it out. And that sector grew, but that sector is also highly connected to political people, highly connected. Right. Now, they represent an interest, but the middle class parents who want Walter Payton, Brooks, Northside College Prep, they also represent an interest. They're also a cost factor in all this.
Yeah.
You know, they're not free. None of these things are free. You know, and charter schools with the Gates Compact, do you know what that is?
You mean the Gates?
Bill Gates.
Bill Gates, yeah.
So Bill Gates around the country created compacts between school districts and charter schools. And that was called an equal funding compact. And the equal funding compact, in fact, cost Chicago Public Schools a lot of money because they were underfunding the charter schools relative to the traditional schools. Now they had to go to equal funding, not necessarily equal pay for the teachers, because that's the decision of the entities on what they're going to pay. But this equal funding made it much less advantageous to open charter schools because you had startup costs and you had an equal funding provision. So there's no simple idea that the charter schools are always going to cost less. I mean, it's a way too simple proposition.
Yeah. To me, I think your perspective is incredibly fascinating because I started covering this when I was in radio during the last year or so of Joe Hannon. That's how far back I go. And if you asked me to come up with one word to describe the last 30 years of CPS, the only word that would fit would be chaos.
Right.
It has been chaos. It was chaos when Kay Roeder was the president of the board and people were jumping up on her desk and screaming during the board meetings. It was chaos during the strikes. It's been chaos during that ridiculous move to Pershing Road. We can go on and on and on, all the things that happened. And in fact, looking back at it, I would say that maybe the one place where there was a whiff of stability was when the school's finance authority was there. I
hate to say that. Well, no, there's truth to that. I mean, Jerome Van Gorkum and Martin Koldyke, you know, they had a pretty deep understanding of finance. And, you know, Martin Koldyke went on to create the Golden Apple Foundation. But they, you know, they kind of held a strict stick.
They sure did.
And that was there was real consequences to that.
Well, one of them is, of course, that it was during that time that the school's finance authority, for all the many things it did and didn't do, it did not allow the Daley administration to take pension holidays, if I'm correct in this.
Right. At that point, they didn't have the complete power to do that because remember what happened was Mayor Daley in 1995, as part of his buy-in to take over, and he did, it's not a full takeover of the district, but his part in taking political responsibility by appointment of the board members, changed the way the pension is funded. And the pension was funded out of our property tax dollars directly paid into the teacher's pension fund. It was a line item on our bill. And it would go right there. Daley said, and at the time it was correct, look at how much money they've got.
Yeah.
You know, they've got this.
It's fully funded. It's
more than fully
104% or whatever.
Way more fully funded. They own this building over on Oak Street. They've got all these assets. You know, shouldn't the kids get some of this?
Yeah.
And, shouldn't this line go to us? And if we're bad and they start to fall apart financially, we're going to make them good. And they wrote that in the bill. And there was a handful of legislators that said no. No. The reason that these teachers kept a separate pension fund, you know, and Chicago was created in, I think, 1895, and the statewide pension fund for the rest of the state was 1933. And they had a chance several points to merge. And they didn't, because they didn't want their funding to be part of the political process. Because it was direct out of property tax line. Now, Daley makes it part of the political process, everybody approves it, and the most cynical part of this whole thing is that it was a Republican governor and a Republican members of the House and Senate that all supported this takeover and the changeover of the money.
So actually, it's interesting that there are, if you look at this timeline from 1895 to the present day, there are some bright lights on that timeline, and that's one of them, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
It's that moment when the pensions for the Chicago Public Schools are no longer directly taken out of your taxes. They go through the political process. The mayor and the city council and the state legislature get their hands on it. And the next thing you know, we have, well, I mean, not the next thing you know, but down the line, we have pension holidays. Right. And that's how the whole thing just devolves into complete chaos.
I mean, you know, they would go before the legislature and make an argument saying, if we don't get this pension holiday, we're in financial trouble. And so we can't make if we make this payment, it's going to hurt the kids. And so down in Springfield, they voted in favor and they voted in favor, and now they won't vote in favor anymore. The last time they brought the bill up, it was sponsored by Speaker Madigan, and it failed. Even his own caucus members didn't vote for it. And he didn't put them under discipline. From what I understand, having talked to members of the Assembly, he just said to them, vote your conscience. You know, I mean, he did what he had to do.
God, they did.
He did what he had to do, you know, for his city, to try what he thought he had to do for another pension holiday, and his own caucus did not support the bill.
So let's talk about a different issue, one that's, I know, very dear to your heart, and that's the question of special education. In the last week or so, at least 227 CPS employees were fired. Some about 69 of them are identified specifically as being in special education, but it's very complicated because a lot of these people are sort of some of this and some of that. There have been people who have said that this is a direct frontal assault on special education in the schools. Do you agree with that?
I believe it is because we've already gone through this year. Prior to Mr. Claypool taking over CPS, there was $42 million in cuts issued against special education. It actually wasn't 42 million, it was 38 million, but that's what they put out in their PR release. And numerous positions were eliminated. And it was based on a formula. And myself and many, many parents, many bright parents, you know, there are very sophisticated Chicago public school parents. There are people that are actuarials, there are people that are, you know, way brighter than me about math. And they looked at the same formula and I saw, and they said, no, this is specious. And we all said the same thing, that there's a federal rule involved here, and that's called maintenance of effort. And that means simply that a school district must spend the same amount that they spent last year on special education from all sources of funding, unless one of two things happens. Unless there's a drop in the number of students, so it costs you less, or the cost for your teachers is less. Like, you have a lot of older teachers that retire and your cost factors are less. CPS initially made none of those claims, they just issued those cuts. Subsequently, they made claims that there was a student drop. There really wasn't a student drop. They couldn't show a student drop. They used very falsified data from different time points. And that was exposed by the Chicago Teachers Union, by the Service Employees Union, by analysts for those groups, and by myself in front of the board. And I would say the director was put in a hot seat, and her name was Marquet Winston. And I was confronted, actually accused by a board member of not knowing anything I was talking about. That in fact this was, you know, a prudent plan, it wasn't going to violate any laws, and she was doing a great job saving money. And Claypool did something extraordinary. He said, well, let's have her come and do a presentation about her plan right now, which is unheard of because he just had taken over. And they said, well, let's wait and do it the next board meeting. At that board meeting, she did a PowerPoint presentation. And it was clear to Mr. Claypool and the people on the board that the numbers didn't make sense.
Huh.
And within a week, she had resigned her position. And they issued on Thanksgiving Eve a PR statement saying, in fact, there was a grievous error made by Chicago Public Schools, that their analytical system for staffing schools was wrong, and we're restoring this money. I think they restored $33 million. And they did technically do that, but there were no teachers to hire by then. So it's sort of a catch-22.
Yeah.
They couldn't fill the positions. There's still positions empty that they authorized to fill.
But those were probably eliminated in this late.
No, because those are administrative positions.
Okay,
So
all right.
we may yet see this happen.
Well, I mean, because it would be easy, again, to be cynical about this and say, well, they're going after special ed because many of those people are not covered under the CTU contract, right?
The administrators were not, that they laid off. None of the staff that were laid off at the network offices and the central offices were under CTU contract.
But what about the teachers?
The teachers that were cut before were under CTU contract, but that is allowable. You know, the union cannot stop a layoff for economic. It's prohibited by law, and they can't strike over a layoff technically either under law.
Which is why we've seen the ranks of CTU drop really heavily in the last couple of years. There's nothing they can actually do about that.
The latest round of layoffs of the administrators is a problem because of the compliance-based bureaucratic nature of special education. And I don't say that to be attacking special education, but there's many rules involved here. And the rules require a bureaucratic oversight or intervention for good or bad, often for bad. With schools. And I'm telling you, there are some teachers out there and what we call case managers who kind of administer special ed at the school-based level that are just as happy not to have anybody looking over their shoulder
I'm sure,
and to say, we'll just survive fine. But there are others that have children that are having major psychiatric problems that need additional support, may in fact need to have the child in a different placement for security, as of yesterday, they had nobody to call.
So,
but they may today. I mean, I don't know.
Because everything is so fluid.
And as a matter of fact, I know one school that actually called up the lawyers over at CPS because they couldn't get through to anybody else to ask them a question on what they should do because there was nobody else answering the phones.
So going back to the to this overarching theme here, it's chaos. It's not an organized attack. Is this an organized attack on special education? Has someone said, look, this is a place where we're spending a lot of money, and maybe we don't need to spend this amount of money. Let's sort of pull back out of this.
Everybody that comes, well, they can't get out of it because of federal law. But what happens, and it happened initially with Paul Vallis too. You look at the budget figures. And you look at cost per child, and you look at the cost per child for special education, and you average it out. And it looks so enormous. And you look at the busing costs for these children, and they look so enormous. And you say, there's got to be cost savings here. Anybody that's a number cruncher is going to look at that. So it's like this big apple that sits there, that people want to pull down the apple and save money. But I will give Paul Vallis this credit. He was educated by some of the staff over at CPS over what it costs to educate a significantly disabled kid and what it costs to educate a learning disabled kid. And to a degree, he became a little bit less hostile to special education and didn't kind of issue the draconian cuts that it sounded like he was going to do when he came in the door. Now,
is it also true, and these are all these things that float in front of us and we kind of believe some of them and not others, but is it also true that the charter schools, largely speaking, don't want to be in the special education business, and they do everything they possibly can to get those kids put back in the public school, whatever you want to call them, traditional schools? I
would say not all of those kids. It's actually a little bit more complex than that.
The more expensive ones.
The more expensive ones. They don't have programs for kids with significant autism, deaf kids, blind kids.
So the answer is a qualified yes. It's not in the charter school's interest.
It's not in the charter. And also, I will give them this They think that they're going to get ripped off by CPS on what they pay them for educating these kids. They have no confidence that they're going to get what they need to educate these kids. That this will be a bankruptcy deal for them if they take a bunch of these kids. And so what they do is they'll say, I'll offer this significantly autistic kid the right to be in whatever charter school, but you're going to have to be in this room with the level of supports that we can provide you, which is basically resource supports that we would normally see for a learning disabled student, and not deep ones either. And those kids can't survive in that. And so some of the families will try it because, frankly, they're very fearful, particularly at the high school level, of violence towards their kids, of gang recruitment. And the one thing that charters have going for them very strongly is a high level of discipline and student control in the buildings. And and families want that.
And of course, again, it sounds like I'm just banging on charters here, but when you essentially have de facto control over who your student population is, and you can take the ones that you don't particularly want for whatever reason and send them back, you're going to have a better student population, you're going to have better control over, and you're going to have parents who are a little bit more engaged. And so everybody says, wow, look at these charter schools. They're able to do the things that the regular schools can't do.
But they aren't able to produce any better results for those disabled students they have than on average CPS. And it's a grim data set. I mean, the last time I looked at ACT scores for students that take the test that are disabled, so they're not they don't have a intellectual disability or another severe disability that they couldn't take the test. It was in the range of a 12 on the ACT score for the average for disabled kids. That will get you into really nowhere. And it probably will not allow you to survive even in a community college. So, the numbers there are very bad, and they don't need to be that bad. Many of these students can have the same ability to go on in life and be educated, but the cost is high and the intensity of instruction is high. And there are parents that fight their way through this and get their kids through college. And they're amazing. And we work with them. And I've represented families like this that fought from the day their kid was in kindergarten, saying, I'm not going to let my kid fall behind. I'll fight you every day. I'll get tutoring. I'll get whatever it takes to keep my kid close to on track so they can graduate and not just be pushed out the door. And those parents are really some of the most amazing people in the city.
That's what you call your motivated parent.
Yeah.
Yeah. Just in the interest of time here, I want to just kind of move on. One quick question, it's not a quick question at all, but overarching question. From where you sit, looking at these numbers, we've seen all of these different Armageddon days. It's February 8th, it's March 15th, it's June, whatever it is. Given that it doesn't look like there's going to be anybody riding to the rescue of CPS anytime soon, is there a drop-dead date? Well,
Chicago Public Schools has an agreement with, I think it's BMO Harris, for short-term credit. And that, as far as I know, is intact. I don't know how much of that line is available to them at any 1 minute. If that line gets pulled, we have a very big problem here, because the funds that come to CPS from property taxes, from many different sources, come in chunks at different times. And in between those times, there's dry periods. And you're going to have a drop in revenue. And so they need either a tax anticipation note or short-term credit lines. If those things start getting pulled, which is what happened in '79 with Joe Hannon, if those things get pulled, you're in big trouble. I have not heard that those have been pulled. This larger bond offering was pulled. Their relationships, I think, are more intimate with those banking people that do the short-term borrowing. But anything can happen, and Joe Hanson I mean, Joe Hannon didn't think it was going to happen to him. As a matter of fact, you know, I interviewed a lot of these people for my master's thesis. And the one thing that they will tell you over and over going back to 79 is, I don't understand how this happened. Because we still had money in the bank. You know, we weren't short, we were making our payments, and then all of a sudden overnight, we're worthless and we're finished. And I'm sure from their perspective, that's the way it seemed. So it's you know, it's a complex deal to look at, and they have their own problems. I mean, in 79, one of the big reasons for this was the collapse of Continental Bank, which we didn't even know was beginning. You know, it was beginning while CPS was going down and consummated after CPS was completely reconstructed, because they had their own problems and they wanted to lower their exposure to risk.
They were overexposed.
Right, and other people wanted to lower their exposure to risk because they were having their own fiscal problems, which explains a lot about how these decisions were made. But there's no law that says they can't do it because this is their money. They can decide to loan it or not. You know, I mean, it's a crazy thing. I mean, it's not like Europe, you know, where you have nationally funded school systems. I mean, this is they have a right to protect their interests.
Let's talk just for a moment about TIFs. We can talk for hours about TIFs, but let's just keep it to a moment or two. Barbara Flynn Curry has proposed that there might be as much as $200 or $300 million just kind of, you know, sitting in the couch cushions over at City Hall from TIF, and that not only would she propose to give that money to Chicago Public Schools, but that she would change the formula so that instead of having to rebate it to the Park District and all the others that are that have contributed to it, they would just basically take that money and give it to CPS. I find that really interesting because it's Barbara Flynn Curry, and I wouldn't think that she would be proposing that unless some people around her in maybe the Rahm administration or something had looked at it and said, well, maybe we could do this.
Well, I give her a lot of credit for it. I mean, it's incredibly courageous because you know, those other legal entities have legal entitlement to this money, you know, on a surplus deal. And I was frankly very amazed by the whole thing. And,
but wouldn't it be hard for the MWRD or something to go to court and say, no, there's 35 million of that's ours and we want it, take it away from the kids and give it to us?
It would be politically difficult, but their lawyers certainly must have contemplated this when they heard it, because I'm sure they have things that they could do with the money too.
Yes, I'm sure they do. Yeah.
But I think it's a great short-term fix. As we know, you know, the money, even though it's a big pot of money, it's finite, and it'll exhaust.
But as Ben Jarofsky points out, well, it doesn't really exhaust because next year they'll get it all back again. They'll get another infusion of it.
It depends on how much the property tax, how much the values go up.
That's right.
You know, and right now it's in question. You know, where the values are going to go up and where they won't. So how much they'll generate immediately year after year is not clear.
I don't know where to go from this. You are absolutely right. For decades, this system has stumbled from one crisis to another, and there's another one waiting out there in the weeds we don't even know about yet.
So how do we fix this?
Hey, Rod. Hey, Rod. Let's finish the show with you telling us how to fix this.
The first thing we have to accept as citizens of Chicago is our property tax rate for schools is lower than anywhere else in Cook County. That's a bitter pill. That's been the case here, not just under Rahm Emanuel, not just under Richard M. Daley, but Richard J. Daley and possibly Kelly. You know, I mean, I don't go back that far, but so our rate is extraordinarily low.
You mean the rate in your property taxes that is devoted to CPS?
If you compare our rate to poor towns like Harvey, Illinois, it's not comparable. So we have a lot of money that we could raise that way, but there's real pressure not to raise those taxes, not even to discuss that issue. My understanding is, as part of the package for CPS survival is that they want to go above what's called the property tax limit, or the cap, and to some degree, and they're going to possibly ask the General Assembly to do that. I'm fine with that. It's required. Even the Civic Federation has recognized this situation, although they don't like property taxes. You know, and it's not a good system. I mean, the whole property tax system for funding education in Illinois is wrong, but that's not on the table anymore amidst all this. So the question is, how much can the taxpayers take? And is the only way to do it is through the General Assembly, because there is a legal mechanism to do that. And we could have a property tax referendum for going above PTEL. And I've urged the Chicago Board of Ed to call a property tax PTEL referendum, because this puts the issue of funding of our kids' education before the public.
Do you think it could pass? Would it be just in Chicago?
It would be just in Chicago. It's questionable, but if there was a serious campaign by organizations from everything from the teachers union to the Democrat Party, it's possible.
And those engaged parents that you're talking about?
But the problem with this is that the majority of people who live in Chicago don't have kids in CPS. And people like Barbara Byrd Bennett, with her indictment, you know, the former president of the board, you know, committing suicide and ending up in the river under very questionable circumstances. You know, all of those history of corruption that gets combined into people's minds that turns a whole institution into a corrupt entity. And you know, when you look at all of those little corrupt things, and they're not little necessarily, 20 million isn't small under Barbara Byrd Bennett, and she's yet to be convicted of it, but it sounds like she's going to plead guilty eventually. They're isolated within the context of the district, but there's assumptions made of systemic corruption. And it's hard to tell how far that goes.
Yeah, and that just poisons the well.
It poisons the well, so that could be the killer on a referendum. So I can understand why they go the General Assembly route if they do decide to go above the tax rate. But this is not, you have to have a sustainable base. And TIFs and all these other deals are not sustainable. And it's unclear what President Cullerton's bill for funding reform will actually do for long-term revenue for CPS. It could be significant. The question of pension parity that he raised, providing the same amount of money for the CPS pension as opposed to they pay to the downstate districts, is a very significant proposal. And that would make a big financial difference to CPS. I don't know what support there is. I've heard out of Chicago Democrats oppose that because they feel like this is a deal that the city created. And the city got themselves into this. And they don't go around attacking other Democrats publicly, but I'm not sure they're going to vote for it.
But might there be a way that all of the smaller school districts who are all suffering themselves, is it possible to get all those people around a giant table and give everybody something?
There is, and I think that that's where this could go, this proposal. But there are other problems with it. For instance, they're running all special ed money in through a common funding line. And that makes many of us in the special education community nervous because it becomes part of a bigger pot, even though you can financially analyze what they're supposed to provide for services. It's a very unnerving proposal on that level. And there are really complex issues for suburban areas that don't want to lose money. And so Governor Ronner yesterday in his State of the State speech said, I support, you know, President Cullerton's bill, which is really Senator Menard's bill, on funding reform, but there cannot be any losers. And not to have losers.
So how does Barrington not lose, but Fort Heights wins and Chicago gets what it needs?
You have to have at least $400 to $500 million of additional revenue. And if you don't have that, there's going to be losers. And so the question Cullerton asked yesterday after his speech is, great that if he wants to do this, but if you want to hold harmless all your districts in the state, we're talking a lot of money, and where's he going to get the money from except from taxes?
That gets into an interesting political thing that we don't have time for now, but it does raise the very interesting point of a heavily damaged mayor of the city of Chicago and a pretty much generally not very much liked governor who could get together and actually do something heroic and historic. They could actually do this for their own,
It's possible, but I do think that the legislature wants some kind of, they're so worried about CPS because they just see the news headlines too.
They just don't trust it.
Yeah. They see the news headlines too, and they see a Barbara Byrd Bennett lurking in every corner.
And they don't see Forrest Claypool as giving them any more confidence, maybe.
I think Forrest Claypool is probably very nervous about what exists in his own entity. To understand all the parameters of potential problems in there. I think he's keeping a very close circle on everything, and that's dangerous because you hear what you want to hear from the people that are right around you.
Especially if you just hired them to bring them in.
And I understand his fears. I mean, he got rid of a lot of very significant people over there. He forced out Tim Cawley, who was one of the key financial architects. He's not a man to be dealt with lightly. Just to get rid of him was a significant move. This guy knew every skeleton in every closet over there. So he got him out, and he got a lot of other people out. So he kind of closed the little world around him. He doesn't know education. He's got an education chief officer who is a young, talented principal, but doesn't have systemic knowledge on reorg, and they're going to bring in consultants on that.
So they're bringing in consultants to do the reorg.
Right, and that makes me nervous too,
Yeah.
To have consultants doing that. And they're reorging special ed using consultants, it looks like to me.
We've just got to stop.
Okay.
At some point, we just have to stop this, okay? So maybe you'll come back again sometime.
Okay.
All right? Okay. Rod Estvan has been with us today from Access Living here in Chicago. You're the research director there, right?
I'm the policy director.
Policy director, sorry. And thanks to them for giving you up for an hour today to come over here and yak with us. You have been watching Chicago Newsroom. It's a service of CAN TV, as you probably well know, and we're really glad to be here and having the opportunity to talk to you on this overtime edition of Chicago Newsroom. We'll be back next week with another program. I hope you'll be with us then. And thank you very much for watching. Don't forget, you can see any of our programs anytime you like just by going to this address, and I hope you'll do that. Thanks for now. We'll see you next week. Bye-bye.